thrilled today to introduce Harris Kashtan. For almost everyone knows Harris quite well, but Harris came to us. He got his undergraduate degree from Berkeley before he went on to UCIS. He's had a very distinguished time with us here, being the hero that we all know he is. He's going on to amazingly exciting work from here. He's been selected to be part of the Special Operations Surgical Team of the Air Force, and at a time when there's a lot going on in the world that needs the support of people like you, Harris. So we're really proud that you've been part of our family here, and looking forward to your comments this morning.
Thanks,
so, thank you.
This presentation, given all the things that have been going on, I figured I'd try to keep it a little lighter. Should not be too axonally taxing, but hopefully will still be interesting. And we'll be looking at evaluating some risk and a few of the different activities and interests that I have that we also might see here from a trauma perspective. First disclaimer, these are my opinions. They are not those of the Department of Defense, the Air Force, and I have also no financial disclosures. So as many of the chief residents have, trying to figure out what to present on is always a very common theme. Research typically is one that's a popular topic. However, in my residency here, I've only produced one first author paper that unfortunately has yet to be cited by anyone else. So I would say the impact rating is low, and especially given that my dad, when he was a resident here, wrote one of the first papers on abdominal compartment syndrome that was subsequently cited by almost 600 other articles. I figure I should probably not focus on research for this presentation. So I was thinking back to actually a discussion I had after Grand Rounds with Andrew Perry, and we were talking about which was more dangerous, his interest in kite surfing or my interest in rock climbing. And that led to a whole bunch of investigation as to ways to actually evaluate the difference in risk between these two activities. And so what we're going to do today is we're going to discuss what a micromort is, how it can be applied. Also going to look at the risk of this in some of our common activities, and then we'll I'm going to try to simultaneously examine the risk, explain some of the injury patterns and some of the activities I do, while potentially even encouraging you to potentially try one day. So we'll see if I can accomplish that. So what is a micromort? So this is a unit of measurement of risk, specifically the chance of dying. It was a concept that came about in the 1970s by a guy named Ronald Howard, who was an engineering professor at Stanford. It represents a 1 in a million chance of dying. That is 1 micromort. And it can be used as a comparative measure of risk between different activities. It really provides rough estimates because there are so many variables that can go into actually determining specific risk that it really is just kind of a ballpark number that you can start with. But I want to look at some of the micromorts of baseline life. So for everyone here who woke up this morning, your micromorts, that was just 22. So 22 micromorts just for waking up. For your first day of life when you were born, that was 430 micromorts. So definitely less risky than the first day you were born. For those fortunate enough to live in Canada, your chance of dying in a homicide is 15. And unfortunately here in the United States, it's about 3 times as high. So 48 micromorts for those living in the United States. A few of the daily activities we like to do. So if you ride a motorcycle, 1 micromort is the equivalent of driving 6 miles on a motorcycle. In a car, it's about 230 miles. For all those who have been drinking wine, especially more so now, half a liter of wine is a single micromort. And then not a pack, but 1.4 cigarettes is a micromort. And unfortunately, if Dr. Schatz is out there listening, drinking Miami water for a year is a micromort. So we're starting to accumulate these rather quickly. For some, they're more applicable to us on the surgery side. The anesthesia, for reference, for non-emergency operations, about 10 micromorts. For those undergoing a cabbage, 16,000 micromorts. Running a marathon, and I didn't even include Ironman in this because that's getting a little crazy. And then, oddly enough, it's safer to climb Mount Everest than undergo a cabbage. But yeah, these actually numbers have been changing as actually climbing Mount Everest has been getting more dangerous. So, how about some of the recreational activities that I've been fortunate enough to participate in? So this was from a nice spring day in Jackson Hole.
Wait forward. Woo! Alright. Alright. Drop. Ah!
So skiing, obviously in Northern California, is a very popular sport. Almost over 11.5 million visits just in the 2018-2019 ski season. There are 16 ski resorts that are within a 2.5-hour drive of Sacramento. And in the 2015-2016 ski season, between skiers, snowboarders, and snowmobilers, they contributed almost $21 billion to the economy, interestingly enough. Here on the map just shows you where all the resorts are in relation to Sacramento. And especially now that we're rotating up at Barton, injury from skiing is something you see very commonly in the ER there. In determining risk, the big distinction is that between inbounds and backcountry skiing. Inbound skiing is within the boundary of the ski resort. And so here you have ready access to first responders. And so these are the ski patrollers who are typically EMTB trained. However, some of them do have paramedic certifications and can deliver medications. The other big thing they do in the ski resorts is avalanche control. In the backcountry, these are often remote areas with very poor cell reception. Oftentimes, response for any injury in the backcountry is going to be hours away. And most of the time, this is typically going to involve helicopter rescue. And that's assuming that you actually have weather conditions that will permit flying. As you can imagine, a lot of times people head to the backcountry when it's snowing, in which case you cannot fly helicopters. And if you can't fly that, then you're waiting on actual people to get to you, which can take hours. So you're looking at a lot longer delay. Obviously, and the other big thing is in the backcountry, there's no avalanche control. And for those of you who aren't familiar with what avalanche control in bounds entails.
Final. Yeah, whatever, Harris. Okay, pull it up. Right there's good.
So that's about a 2.5 pound, 2.5 pound stick of TNT.
I just think that was a little close to that.
Yeah. So typically ski patrollers will carry a pack of about 30 pounds of high explosives as they go along the ridges at most ski resorts. Unfortunately, About 5 years ago, there was a ski patroller at Squaw Valley who was killed from an explosion while doing avalanche control. Injuries from that kind of blast are very uncommon because there are a huge amount of safety regulations that are put into doing avalanche control, but it still does happen, and potentially something you might see on the trauma side if you're ever working anywhere in a ski town. So skiing mortality, skiing inbounds is actually very safe. On average, over the last 10 years, only about 38 people have been killed in ski resorts nationwide. And this is for 55 million skier days. So that comes out to basically a micromort of 0.7. And there's actually really good statistics because there's an entire organization that tracks deaths and injuries in ski resorts. What's probably more significant to most people here is the skiing morbidity. And so injuries are relatively more common. So you have Johns Hopkins, estimated about 600,000 individuals a year injured. So that accounts for about 2 out of every 1,000 skier visits. There's a separate category called catastrophic injuries. These are defined as those that are major neurologic, head, spinal cord injuries, or loss of a limb, but do not include a death. These are also relatively low, only about 46, so about equivalent for number of deaths a year. Now, one thing for people who've been skiing for some time I have noticed is that the use of helmets has increased pretty drastically at the ski resort. Pretty much everyone now wears a helmet, and especially kids. And with this, we've seen a decrease in the number of concussions every year, so from 1995 to 2012, when as they've been looking at this. But interestingly enough, number of deaths has not been impacted by the use of helmets in skiing. And the biggest reason is that the helmets that we use in skiing only protect to about a speed of about 12 miles an hour. Beyond that, they don't do a whole lot for you. The average speed for fatality from skiing, you're going about 25 to 40 miles an hour. And so even though everyone's out wearing helmets and thinks they're really protected, they really are designed to help with concussions from hitting the snow. As far as the mortality in the backcountry, the majority of these deaths all come from avalanches. In the U.S., there were 256 avalanche deaths over the last 10 years, only 7 of which occurred in the resorts. So this is also a topic I like to bring up, is that even skiing in the resort after a heavy storm can expose you to avalanche danger. In fact, this year at Alpine Meadows, there was an individual who was killed in an avalanche. He basically was skiing in an area that they had done control work on, and he got caught in an avalanche and then taken into a tree, which causes pretty significant blunt trauma. Those avalanches move around anywhere from 60 to 70 miles an hour down the hill. And so you can imagine getting caught into that and then pulled into a fixed object like a tree or over a cliff can cause pretty significant injuries. They were looking at a study out of Switzerland that tried to look at the mortality for a ski touring day. And this was around 9 micromorts. So it's about a 10-fold more risky to go backcountry skiing than inbound skiing, but still relatively low. Injuries are much harder to quantify because a lot of these individuals, if they've been skiing in the backcountry, either don't seek help or seek delayed help, and then it's really hard to track. What's an interesting fact is that avalanche courses are becoming more popular, but they increase your chance of dying, in that it's likened to surgery where you don't know what you don't know. And so people will do an introductory avalanche course. They'll start going out into the backcountry to start trying this, and they think they know a lot more than they do. They expose themselves to a lot more avalanche danger, and they end up getting buried or caught in one and drawn into some hard object and killed. What's actually a great resource now is that throughout this nation, there are actually avalanche forecasting websites that do it for free, where you can basically go on there and they do a full analysis. And that's actually one of the first things in these courses that they recommend is before you ever go out, you look at these websites that basically will tell you everything to do and really do a good job of evaluating risk on a day-to-day basis. So some of the takeaways from the skiing section: inbound skiing is relatively safe. You should continue to wear a helmet, but you should know the limitations. Backcountry skiing, considerably more dangerous. And then understanding decision-making, knowing kind of where your weaknesses are, can definitely play a large role in mortality and preventing that. Rock climbing. Now, these gyms are not open right now, so even if you're interested in taking up rock climbing, you would not be able to, at least until coronavirus has passed.
It's interesting to me that you can learn to do this now in a gym.
Yeah, and as we'll get into it, it's becoming more and more popular. So rock climbing has been growing in popularity in the United States over the last few decades. From 2012 to 2017, actually the number of climbing gyms in the country is surpassing the number of normal gyms that have been created. So they've seen an increase of almost 4%, whereas normal gyms are only increasing by about 3%. Another interesting trend that we've been seeing is that while people who are going to the gym is relatively been stable, the number of people who have been venturing outdoors to start climbing is increasing. And this is actually where the risk has been going up, because gym climbing is actually very safe. Climbing outdoors is where you start to inherit some of this risk. There are 9 indoor gyms within 20-minute drive of Sacramento, seen on this map. And then outdoors, as you know, California is one of the world destinations for rock climbing. Just within a 2-hour drive, there are dozens of locations. And then Yosemite, which is the world mecca of rock climbing, is a 3-hour drive, which is very possible to do post-call. Then you sleep, then you climb, then you come back for your call shift the next day. So getting into the types of climbing will help a little bit stratify some of the risk. This right here is our resident Dr. Coleman, who's demonstrating lead climbing in a gym. In the gym, you can do 3 types. There's top roping, that's basically where you're hanging straight. There's a rope that goes off of the top of a route, connects to you, and keeps you basically on a belay the entire time, so you're not falling any distance. Lead climbing is what I was doing in the first video, as well as what Dr. Coleman is doing here, where you climb up and you clip these things called quick draws that help arrest your fall, but you do fall some distance. Where this can be potentially be dangerous is as you fall, you can swing into things, or if your leader and belayer are different weights, your belayer can actually end up pretty far going up while your leader swings into them. The last type of climbing in the gym is called bouldering, and this is basically where you climb 10 to 15 feet up, and you have no protection, but they have about a 2-foot padded floor. So if you fall off of it, you can definitely have injuries, but your risk of obviously death is very low from that. Outdoor climbing is similar in that you have both top rope and lead climbing. What's important here is in sport climbing, you have these bolts that are drilled directly into the rock. These can support up to 22 kilonewtons, which is basically more force than any fall a human could generate. And these bolts have basically sustained people falling hundreds of feet on a rope and catching and not pulling out. So these are actually very safe. Where the risk really starts to come in is in what we call traditional climbing. This is where there's no protection that's built naturally into the rock. You're basically using these devices over here, which are called cams and nuts, and you're placing them into cracks and crevices, and then clipping the rope into them. These are very user dependent, and people, they can actually basically rip out of the rock with a hard fall. And knowing how well they can be placed and what's going to support a fall is something that just takes years and years of experience. But unfortunately, a concept called zippering, which is basically where all of them pull out during a heavy fall and people keep falling, becomes a really big risk for injury, because you can either hit ledges below you or you can even ground strike where you actually hit the ground. Another kind of interesting is called big wall climbing. This is where you're basically using the same kind of gear, but you're climbing 1,000-feet faces. These are very common in Yosemite. Things like El Capitan. This picture over here is called Washington Column. And this is where you sleep actually on the wall in a tent that's called a portaledge here. And so you're suspended thousands of feet off the ground, sleeping on what amounts to a hanging cot, which is actually quite nice. And then the last type that we're not going to get a huge amount into, but many people have seen the movie Free Solo. Free soloing is basically the climbing without the use of any rope or protective gear. Falls in this are almost uniformly fatal. And unfortunately, when it comes to free soloists, it's not a question of if, but when. Some have done it for for decades, but almost all of the major free soloists out there have died from this. So I wouldn't encourage this type to jump into if anyone's interested. So the mortality from rock climbing, annually there are about 30 deaths from climbing for about 5 million U.S. rock climbers. So that estimates the micromorts at around 3 per climb. For gym climbing, there have been 4 deaths since these came about in the 1980s. So this is exceedingly safe. These basically come from people not paying attention while belaying their partner, and their partner then falls. So it is a team activity. Deaths in climbing are most of the time related to human error, not so much equipment failure. And this is kind of where it's interesting to see the parallels between surgery and rock climbing. One of the more dangerous parts of rock climbing is not the climb itself, but actually the end of it, the rappelling, where you descend from the climb. And a lot of this is because you're tired, you're already thinking about getting home, getting dinner, and you start making you start making stupid mistakes that can potentially be life-threatening. And I kind of liken this in surgery, where you have a long day of cases, and it's typically, as we all know, the last case always seems to be the hardest one, because mentally you might not be as sharp as you were at the beginning of the day. The other thing that could prevent a lot of these are checklists, and these are things that mentally we do the same thing in rock climbing. You do the same procedure, just like a checklist in the operating room, and using that when you're tired is going to help prevent making silly errors that can potentially be life-threatening. Another parallel is that the American Alpine Club actually posts an annual review of all incidents that get reported in the United States at the end of every year. And they do a really good job. This is essentially their morbidity and mortality report. And so they look at each of these incidents, and they break them down into a variety of factors which contributed. Each of them has about 7 parts. They summarize what's known and what's unknown. They look at what was potentially chance versus what was human error. They also look at what causes contributed, what judgment contributed, and then they do a really good job of actually making the stories come to life and telling a good story. In 2018, there were 187 accidents and 198 injuries. A separate study showed that about 30% of these injuries involve lower extremities. 30% of them involved head and spine injuries. So even though a lot of climbers wear these helmets, they're not fully encompassing of the head. And when you take a fall, especially with swinging, you can swing into the rock, contact your head, as well as your back and neck. So these are this is definitely an interesting injury pattern that we see. Interestingly, rock fall made only up a small cause of injuries in rock climbing. Gear failure was even lower. And when they look back, it's all decision making that plays the biggest role in people having accidents. So this I thought was an interesting case report. There was a 55-year-old man who was working on a speed ascent to the nose. That means is basically trying to climb the nose of El Capitan, which is 3,300 feet, as fast as he physically could. At 2 p.m., he fell about 20 feet after pulling out some of the gear that he had placed, struck a ledge, causing a pylon fracture in one leg, calcaneus fracture in the other. This is where he fell on that face. The Yosemite Search and Rescue was called. They were able to reach him by 7 p.m., so it took them 5 hours from when he called to when they could actually get to him. It took them another 3 hours just to get him to the top of that. And because it was already got dark at that point, they airlifted him to Fresno the next day. This individual was a guy named Hans Floring, who's a professional climber, has climbed the nose over 100 times, held a speed record for a number of years, and even he is not immune from making mistakes and having pretty significant injuries. What I also like just about this case is these climbers are oftentimes in very inaccessible areas that are going to take long times to extricate. Oftentimes they're just getting simple buddy aid in the field. So when they do arrive to you, they oftentimes might be much more far along in their disease process than you might think. So some of the takeaways, as we just described that, many of the areas are also very limited. A lot of them have very poor cell reception. And then decision making can play a large role in morbidity and mortality in rock climbing. Anyone interested? No. So skydiving is also increasing in popularity. Last year alone, there were 3.5 million skydives in 2019. There are 2 drop zones that are within 40 minutes of Sacramento. A lot of people, especially in the trauma department, have probably heard of one of them. Lodi down 30 minutes south of here. Has been in the news quite a bit. Interesting enough, about 1 to 2% of the population have gone on a skydive in their life. Most of these are tandem skydives where you're attached to another individual. But interestingly enough, you can actually do, with a training course, you can do your first skydive with your own gear and without another person if you're really interested. I thought that this was just entertaining. And how they've laid out some of these landing areas for some of the drop zones. This is the one that's in Davis. The landing area is right here, and the gun club is right here. So you probably wouldn't think that somebody skydiving would come in as a penetrating injury, but multiple people have landed in that gun club. Fortunately, the shooters usually can see them slowly coming down and hold their fire prior to landing. The other one is at Lodi. The landing area is there, and then Highway 99 is right next to it. And unfortunately, there was a death this last year where there was a lot of wind that was coming from the left side of this picture, and a skydiver was trying to turn and come into the wind over the freeway, as she didn't predict she didn't predict that it was going to have so much wind. And what can happen with parachutes is that you can fall straight down if there's too much wind. And unfortunately, she didn't realize this soon enough, because had she done so, she could have turned another 180 and basically ended up across the freeway. So she basically continued trying to make progress, came down on the freeway, and a semi hit her. But it's one of those things where no part of her gear was a problem. It was all the thinking and the thought process that led to that death. So skydiving mortality is relatively safe. We're actually getting safer every year. Here you can look at the fatalities per 1,000 jumps every year, and you can see that it's slowly going down. In 2018, there were only 18 deaths worldwide, only 13 in the U.S. Largely due, mostly to improved safety awareness and some improvement in the gear. Every year in March, drop zones hold safety briefings, basically an entire day dedicated to safety, where they also do the equivalent of a morbidity and mortality conference, where they go over the last year, they look at the incidents, the injuries, they discuss how thinking and ways of preventing these going forward can be implemented in order to prevent deaths in their jumpers, and it's actually showed that it's been really effective. And so looking at total, if you look at total jumps as well as fatalities, your micromort for a skydive is about 4. So, like I said, the majority of deaths from skydiving come from poor decision making, not the equipment failure. There actually, in 2018, there were 0 deaths from a parachute not opening. What probably would surprise people is there were 3 deaths attributed to cardiac arrest in free fall. There are a lot of people who started skydiving in the 60s and 70s who are still skydiving today. And that population, you do have to do a type of flying physical to get certified to skydive, but it's basically going and seeing your home doc and them saying, yeah, this seems like a good idea. So one of the other things that you might not consider is when you get somebody who potentially would be brought from a skydive area, if they're elderly or older, I should say, is that medical issues can certainly have contributed. The other thing is I've got listed here is that your average, when you look at the deaths, average age around 48, but the average number of jumps 3,500. So these are not. They're not people who, it's not like the person who's out there learning how to do this. The majority of these are people who have very advanced licenses, advanced training, and it comes to a lot of times complacency, where people get very used to things they do a lot, and then they start making errors because they're not thinking about what can go wrong and planning for that. And then also, what I like to show here too is that of those who died, men are much better at killing themselves skydiving than women are. So I want to show you, this is the kind of forces that can be on a skydiver during landing.
Oh, wow. Oh. Oh.
So that is a discipline called swooping. And the idea behind that is you try to get as much speed as you can in the last 300 feet of your skydive under canopy to go as fast as you can along the ground. Doing so, you're going up speeds of upward 80 miles an hour, and you're basically hovering about a foot off the ground. And you have to plan all this from 300 feet up. So you can imagine that if your timing is off or your inputs are off, even a little bit, you basically drive yourself straight into the ground going 80 miles an hour. Obviously, the kind of trauma that results from an unprotected crash going that speed is going to be pretty catastrophic. So in 2014, there were about 730 injuries for the 3.2 million skydives, so about 2.3 injuries per 10,000 jumps. Most of these are occurring during landing. Normal speed that you're going to see in landing is about 20 to 30 miles an hour, so still relatively high speed for not having really any protection around you. But as we said, that swooping, you can go up to 80 miles an hour. Most common injury pattern that we see are typically low extremities, so femur fractures and pelvic fractures are really common from these type of injuries, which obviously demonstrate the high force mechanism that's involved. Another kind of interesting thing that didn't really think about was what's called opening shock. So this is rapid deceleration from just the parachute opening, so the parachute doing the job it's supposed to be doing. Normally, the parachute's open with about 3 to 5 G-forces of deceleration that is exerted on the person over about 3 to 6 seconds. Parachutes are designed to slowly open over time, losing as much as 500 to 1,000 feet as it opens. However, if you pack a parachute incorrectly, they can exert up to 9 Gs of force over you over the period of about a second. And this can result in significant spine and neck fractures, as well as tearing of the aorta. And what they found is that older individuals who have more calcification in their aorta, who have a hard opening, makes their aorta much more susceptible to this shearing force. What's evolved in skydiving from a safety evolution is that nearly every skydiver wears a helmet similar to this one, but it wasn't until 2017 that these actually were impact rated. And the reason why is that there's a lot of design that has to go into making a helmet that can sustain an impact, but is not so heavy that when you have the opening of a parachute, the head doesn't keep accelerating down while the body pulls up, causing cervical injuries. So it took a while, but they now do have impact-rated helmets. And then this was another interesting device here. In 1991, they created the first reliable automatic activation device. That's what this arrow is pointing to. This little device, if you are traveling at free fall speeds, which is around 100 miles an hour, and you pass a certain altitude, usually it's about 1,000 feet, this little device will automatically open your reserve parachute for you if you have not pulled. So people who get knocked out mid-flight have been thousands of lives have been saved by this little device, which was actually a revolution. These are required for all student jumps, and then most drop zones will require these for all their jumpers. So some of the takeaways: skydiving has a relatively low mortality. As community ages, medical events are becoming more common, and then there are very high forces that are involved with the injuries. So when you see, I think it was in the last year or two, we actually did get a trauma patient from the Skydive Center up in Davis. So just when you're evaluating them, considering the amount of force that can go into some of these injuries. So totally, just to summarize, so hopefully you realize many of these dangerous sports aren't nearly as dangerous as you might think. The human decision-making and education can go a lot to improve the safety of these activities. And for whatever reason, everyone here in this residency loves running a marathon, which is clearly much more dangerous than a lot of these. So if you're considering running a marathon, potentially consider jumping out of a plane instead. So I'd like to thank Dr. Salcedo and Dr. Leshkar, as well as the other attendings who've really taken a real big interest in resident development, resident well-being, and have really made this residency enjoyable to be in. I also obviously like to thank our residency class who've been there for this whole time, and it was great getting together, seeing everyone at Thanksgiving this year, as well as weddings. I'd like to thank my really good friends and family who've also supported me for this entire time. Definitely made the process easier. And then lastly, my fiance, Keely, who basically has the same interest in all the things that I do. So it was easy to convince her to go and do them with me, and I definitely couldn't have done this without her. So let's see if for our last video. Notice the gunshots. No visit to UC Davis that day. All right.
Wow. Fantastic. What an amazing, I loved your analogies between surgery and a lot of these activities. The human error, you don't know what you don't know. I'm not sure I still believe you. I'd really like to be able to carefully evaluate the literature on whether running a marathon is more dangerous than a couple of those activities, but pretty exciting. All right, we've got some time for questions. Who wants to know how to sign up? Dr. Jordan.
What did you decide about windsurfing?
Windsurfing had, so the kite surfing had a micromort of about 4, so it's actually pretty equivalent to to rock climbing. And most of those injuries are from getting pulled, interestingly, having really big winds come up, getting pulled into rocks and other fixed objects as well, because you're attached to that sail. There are cutaways. I personally don't do it. Dr. Perry did. And the other thing I like to say is almost all the pictures in there were of residents in this program. So I thought it was just cool that so many people join me.
I couldn't help but think my husband was a rock climber, but before I knew him, and remembering all of those people who, you think of some of the stories, if you read the history of Yosemite, etc., those days when all that was done before cell phones and everything else, you really just depended on your friends thinking this was too long before you were back.
And not only that, that was also back in the day before they really had good ropes that actually were elastic, had some elasticity in them. Also, where they basically, the harnesses were what are called swami belts. You basically take some nylon, wrap it around, and people got pelvic fractures from taking hard falls on bad harnesses and ropes that didn't extend.
Manny, anybody from the? Well, we got Dr. Gargansky.
I was wondering if you've seen any carryover in terms of like skills that you developed doing all your crazy things, or if you just more use it as an escape and fun.
Definitely, most of it is probably for the escape. Although I think that some of it definitely carried over. Like when I was up at Barton, and considering when we got patients from the field who were either involved in rock climbing accidents or skiing accidents, I think knowledge about what that all entails definitely helped at least just kind of give you a mental picture of kind of what their injury pattern might look like and how taking care of them might be, what best you could do to take care of them.
It would be interesting to do a study on how many, because if you just think of your colleagues, how many surgical people are involved in activities like this. And I think there is some carryover between, one, a little bit of thrill seeking, but also the skills you develop of being able to think under pressure in stressful environments and how you respond to, when things really do get tough in the operating room. I think there are a lot of parallels.
Yeah.
So first to the ethosphere, and then Dr. Mal.
Dr. Kokenauer has a question. She asked, how about whitewater kayaking? It was one of the sports that I thought was one of the most dangerous that she's done.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry. I do not have any of the data on whitewater kayaking, so I don't want to give her a wrong answer. But I also know that Dr. Holcroft used to be a big whitewater kayaker, and so I think I'm assuming there's definitely a lot of risk, especially as you get into higher level rapids with that.
Dr. Mal.
So I'm just curious if this, your extracurricular activities have somehow had some influence on your assignment moving forward in the Air Force. Is there a relationship?
There certainly is.
You could talk a little bit about what your assignment actually is. That might be
Yeah. So, mine for the special operations surgical team, you go through a selection process to get it. So it obviously selects out for people who are interested in kind of training and working in austere environments. What the team entails is there are 6 people on a team. So there is a surgeon, an anesthesiologist or a nurse anesthetist, a surgical tech, an ER doctor, an ER nurse, and a respiratory tech. And you're designed as a fully mobile operating room. So you carry everything that you're going to operate with on your back. And you basically build an operating room wherever they need it. The idea is that it came about because we wanted individuals, we wanted our special operators, so the guys who go out there and do the particularly dangerous stuff, to basically be within 10 minutes of somebody who could surgically treat them. And so because they're going into very far out places, there's not going to be any fixed hospitals or establishments. So you have to create a team that can basically follow them and set up somewhere that you can receive them, triage them, and then treat them surgically. And it's almost all, as you'd imagine, all damage control surgery. So you take kind of the bare minimum you need to do a trauma XLAP, and you basically try to stabilize them, package them, and then get them evacuated as quickly as possible. And that's kind of what, obviously I can't speak, I haven't started doing it yet, but that's basically what the job entails.
Doesn't sound that different from your rock climbing.
So one of my favorite quotes is Mark Twain's lies, damn lies, and statistics, right? So, and I might be slightly defensive based on the American discussion. So I think, did you actually look at, so there's obviously, there's catastrophic, there's injury, etc. So when you talk about the micromort from a marathon or an Ironman or whatever versus rock climbing or doing those other things, there's also, did you look at any of the math having to do with, obviously a lot more people who, hey, I'm going to go out and run is a lot more than I'm going to go jump out of an airplane. So your selection of who might be doing these changes the micromorts. There's a very large subjective, I think, number that goes into that makes the micromorts. So is there any correction when people are doing these numbers? Mm-hmm. So it's not as sensational to say, it's only 4 micromorts to jump out of a plane, it's 22 to run a marathon. But there's a lot of, so is there any correction to that type of numbers?
Yeah. There's really not, and like you said, that's the where I put that. These are basically a lot of times a little bit obviously sensationalist, sometimes just a ballpark. And you have for people who go around run a marathon, like you said, it's like, oh, I think I'm gonna go run a marathon today. Now that being said, you can also say, oh, I'm gonna go skydive today. So that might be similar. There you have more safety equipment. But yeah, for people who go out and rock climb who injure themselves, there's just pretty high entry costs. There's a lot of training, there's a lot of understanding all the equipment that goes into that. And so that, if you think of it relatively, like if you took the same person who would train for a marathon, the micromorts would definitely be lower than rock climbing, because most of the time the people who go out and do the rock climbing have done at least more than just got off the couch, so to speak. That being said, the interesting thing that comes about is that the people who are injured oftentimes have huge amounts of experience. And so while there's a correction factor there might also be a correction factor in the other direction where your experience and your knowledge in a field might even make you more susceptible to injury. You might push yourself harder. You might end up thinking you're overconfident in what supplies. Maybe I don't need water at this checkpoint. Maybe I think I'm doing good. And so there might even be a correction in the other direction as well.
How old was George Bush? Was it his 80th birthday or his 90th birthday when he?
I think it was his 80th birthday when he went on a skydive down Texas. Yep. So see, you can do it till, like I said, till the day.
I was thinking about those calcified aortas.
We're on the date.
What's that? Yeah.
Oh my.
As they, yeah.
I had a comment related to Dr. Mill's question. I think what you do here, you'll find, and I hope this is true, that it'll give you credibility with the special operators that you work with the next couple of years. Being able to understand what those people do on a daily basis as far as skydiving, rock climbing, things like that. And really commend you for taking on this. It's a very difficult assignment. And I think what you do outside of medicine will really give you a lot more to offer.
Thank you. Yeah, fortunately, one of the things I really enjoyed doing in residency was working with our pararescuemen in the Air Force. Those are basically our Air Force special operators who do they basically jump into active battles, treat our soldiers who've been injured, and then evacuate them. And we fortunately get to help do some of their medical training through both David Grant and UC Davis. And one of the fun things I got to do is after doing a lot of training with them, I actually got to go do a skydive with them out at Davis. which was really enjoyable. And so it is definitely they've been a really good group. I look forward to working more with those kind of guys.
It's amazing to just reflect for a minute on the tremendous ability of human beings to do extraordinary things, particularly when there's a need and under pressure. And some of that has even been seen on a different scale, but in the activity that's happening now, particularly around New York, and people, moving back into the fray with integrity, service, and excellence. So thank you so much.
Thank you very
Really.
much.